Good morning, Year 10, and welcome back to another video about what we should be doing at school if you were there, and just trying to kind of get you going and make sure that you know what you should be doing during this time of quarantine, and just keep you ticking along, really. There's a bit of confusion about the stuff that I was talking about in the videos last week because I was doing my best impression of Boris Johnson and not being really clear what I wanted. So I'm just going to clear that up now and make sure that everyone is clear. I say clear a lot in those sentences, so you know that I'm trying to be clear. Basically, the exam questions I talked about in the lessons, I would like you to do, and I would like you to send them to me. So far, I've only had 5 people complete an exam question and send them to me, and so I would like that to increase. So if you can't remember, or if you need a reminder, the first exam question was in lesson 4. It was on the impact of World War I in Germany section, and it was this question: in what ways were the lives of people in Germany affected by the World War? 2 paragraphs, 8 marks. I just want you to tell me what was the effects of it, and you should by now have done the information on there, so you should be able to kind of answer that question. Almost definitely. The other thing, I've just got rid of that page, that's annoying, 1 second. The other exam question was in the same place, but it was in lesson 5. So let me just get there. Lesson 5 on Treaty of Versailles, and it was the interpretation question. I know there's 2 questions here, they're both 4 marks, but in your exam they will both be put together. So I will expect you to do both of them and send them along to me so I can mark them. As I said, I've only got 5 so far out of a class of about 27. So can we please make sure that these are done, because it means that I can keep track of what everyone's doing and if people need help, and I can kind of focus on some things in these videos that otherwise I wouldn't have done. Today I'm going to be looking at political unrest in 1919 and 1920. It is lesson 6, and I'm going to be talking you through the things that you need to do, and also talking you through what happens in these times as well. So without further ado, I'm going to just get on with it. So the period after the First World War in Germany was a period of severe issues. Obviously, last lesson, in the last video, I was talking about the Treaty of Versailles, and I was talking about how the Treaty of Versailles had kind of ruined Germany in multiple ways. So financially, they had no money left. They had to pay a lot of money to other countries in Europe, and they struggled with that. Politically, they had no happiness left. The people felt downtrodden after the war. Germany was essentially blamed for the World War, and so on a European stage, Germany was seen as a troublemaker. They were seen as a horrible country, and a lot of people were quite upset about that in Germany as well. And militarily, the military had been almost reduced to nothing, and it got to the point where Germany didn't feel like they had any control over what would happen to them. And so the period between 1919 and 1923 was a really, really big time for Germany, and a big issue for Germany, because they struggled to keep control. They struggled to keep a government that was strong and would put through things that would help people in Germany, and they really, really struggled to quell lots of different uprisings. And on that note, for your exam, you need to know about 3 different uprisings that took place. These 3 uprisings were the Spartacist uprising of January 1919, the Kapp Putsch of March 1920, and the Munich Put of 1923. You need to know what all these 3 events were. What I would suggest you do is, while I'm talking about them and in your own time, is create like a fact sheet page or a mind map or something that would help you know about what these events were in your notes, so you can go back to them and you can revise from them in the future. That's the key thing, because these 3 uprisings were some of the main issues that were going through what was happening in Germany at this time. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk through all three of them, and I'm going to tell you the key events, the key things that happened, and make sure that you've got a good, solid knowledge about what they are that you can use to continue to make those sheets in your own time. So the Spartacist uprising was the first one. It happened in January 1919. Okay, so even before the Treaty of Versailles had been signed, and the Spartacists were communists. They were socialists. So they believed that the country of Germany should turn to socialism. They should remove the main government at the time, get rid of capitalism, start sharing out the wealth that the country is supposed to have had, and set up a communist state. So very similar to Russia. If you think about world events at this time, in 1917, Russia had their October Revolution, and they had become communist, and they had set up a communist state. And by 1919, actually, it was becoming quite a strong state at that time. It was still had some serious issues, but to the world, to other countries in the world, it looked pretty strong. And so what the Spartacists under people like Rosa Luxemburg and a man called Liebknecht, okay, what they believed was that Germany should become a communist state, very, very similar. And what they did is they called for a wave of strikes across Germany. And they set up demonstrations in Berlin. They had the trains stopped through Berlin as well, tried to create as many different issues for the government in one day. And they also occupied many of the newspapers in Berlin as well. And leaders of the movement eventually ended up at the police headquarters. They elected what they called an interim revolutionary committee, which were the people that would take over the government after they'd overthrown it, and the government considered this a revolt. And so what happened was, a couple of days later, the government got together. They got together what we call the Freikorps, which I'll come on to in a second. And the Freikorps basically invaded the newspaper, took over the newspaper that the Spartacists had occupied. They shot everybody on sight, essentially, and took the leaders prisoner. And what happened after that was the leaders of the Spartacists eventually were executed, and the Spartacist uprising was defeated. It was a big thing, though, because occupying newspapers and starting to print things that were pro-revolutionary, and also stopping all forms of transport in one district, as well as having skirmishes, having fights with people in the streets, caused a massive issue across Berlin. And Berlin at this time is the capital, the main city of Germany. So what they did is they had a very, very widespread knowledge. They drew attention to themselves, but in the end, the uprising was quelled within a few days. Now, I said I'd come back to the Freikorps. The Freikorps, because Germany wasn't allowed a large army, what they did is the people that were part of the German army that had to lose their jobs because the army had to be reduced, were basically left unemployed at this time. And what Friedrich Ebert, who was the leader of the Weimar Republic during this time, did is he took these people on board. He said, I've got a job for you to do. You're not an army anymore, but I'm still going to give you weapons. I'm still going to provide you with equipment like an army would, but it's actually a security service. And the Freikorps were basically just ex-army people that were doing a security service in many major cities. And because they were ex-army, and because they weren't police, and because they weren't very... they didn't follow rules very well, they weren't particularly disciplined, it caused massive issues, because they were much more violent and much more against people that didn't believe what the Freikorps believed, and would execute people in the streets for having a different opinion. So the Freikorps were a massive issue, and we'll come back to those over the time that we're talking about this, because they were used a few times. In the end, Luxembourg and Liebknecht were executed, and they were seen as martyrs by the communists. But in the end, this kind of fizzled out, and the Spartacist uprising was over by the middle of January. So that's the Spartacist uprising. There's more information available about it online, but that's the key kind of events, the key things that happened. Okay, so the next uprising was the Kapp Putsch, which was March 1920. So basically a year and a couple of months after the Spartacist uprising. And this took place in Berlin again. And essentially what happened was Wolfgang Kapp, who was a civil servant who didn't particularly like the democratic government of Friedrich Ebert, and didn't really like the way that the government was bowing to the European countries through the Treaty of Versailles, decided that he was going to try and take control of the country by force. Okay, so he was planning this coup for a very, very long time, and a coup is where you take control of a country using military tactics and force people out of their government. And he'd been planning it for a long time, and the time came in March 1920 because he had assistance from a General Luttwitz, who led a group of Freikorps men. So those Freikorps that broke up the Spartacist uprising, some of them had decided that they were fed up with the government as well, and they had decided that they were going to create a new government that was nationalistic, so pro-Germany, very much similar to what we ended up with the Nazis, but with Kapp as Chancellor, as the leader of the government. This was much more successful than the Spartacist uprising. It wasn't successful in the end, but it was much more successful. And Ebert had to actually leave Berlin and set up a new government in Dresden, which is another city in Germany. And basically, the Kapp coup worked for a time in Berlin. And they managed to take control of some of the main offices of government in Berlin. However, while Ebert was away in Dresden, he had ordered the workers who weren't necessarily in favour of this uprising to strike against Kapp, and to stop working and ensure that Kapp couldn't move around, couldn't get around Berlin because none of the air transport network was working. And this doomed the putsch. Essentially, they couldn't do anything because they couldn't move around Berlin. They couldn't organise any uprisings or protests. They couldn't organise anything to take control of the rest of the country because they had no way of doing it. And so the actual putsch only lasted about 5 days. But it showed that the government was weak. The government could be forced out of the capital, out of Berlin, and it showed that there was a thought towards revolution across the country at this time that people were finding quite good. They thought it was a good thing. And what happened after that was the people that supported this uprising, remember it was a nationalistic uprising, so people that supported nationalism and pro-Germany and very, very against anyone that's not German, those people who supported this putsch would eventually be the support base for the Nazis in the future. So while the putsch, the coup was completely unsuccessful, it laid the foundations for future coups and putschs that were more successful. Speaking of those, although this one wasn't successful, the Munich Put in 1923 is different to the other two because it took place in Munich, whereas it didn't happen in Berlin. And the Munich Putsch, or it's otherwise known as the Beer Hall Putsch, because actually it started out in a beer hall in Munich, as most things do. The Beer Hall Putsch was the first time that we see Hitler in this course. Hitler was someone, as we know, as it's become a piece of common knowledge now, was an Austrian man who he left Austria because he couldn't get into art school. He became homeless, and he moved to Germany and joined the German army during World War One. And he was heavily injured during World War One, and to the point where he was almost blinded at the end of the war, and he was in hospital when the armistice was signed. And this annoyed him greatly. He did not like the fact that he did not see the war out. He did not like the fact that the Germans had surrendered. He saw it as a show of weakness. And what he did in the years after the war is he left the army and started to look for causes that kind of agreed with him, and agreed with the fact that the Treaty of Versailles was an anti-German travesty, was horrible for the German people, and he started to look for people who agreed with him. And eventually, in Munich, in a beer hall, he started to get a regular kind of slot where he would stand up and he would talk to the people in the beer hall. And people started listening to Hitler. And as we know, Hitler is a very, very good public speaker, and he's very, very good at getting people to believe what he's saying and get people to mobilize in his kind of name. And eventually, by 1923, he had got enough people that he believed to march in Munich and take control. Stage a coup, so to speak. And about 2,000 Nazis marched to the city centre of Munich, where they were confronted by a police cordon, and eventually shots were fired. And many high-ranking Nazis, many people from the Nazi party who were friends with Hitler, were wounded or killed. There was the death of 14 Nazis, and 4 police officers were killed in this putsch. Hitler was wounded in the putsch, and he was taken to the countryside to kind of get over the wound, but eventually he was arrested after a couple of days and charged with treason. Interestingly enough, Joseph Goebbels, as you may know from your Year 9 studies, was also part of this putsch, was shot in the shoulder, was almost killed, and was treated by a Jewish doctor in Munich, given first aid, essentially, and this Jewish doctor saved his life, which is an interesting thought when you think about what the Nazis went on to do. So, as you can see, it wasn't particularly successful, it didn't particularly work, and the main leaders of the Munich Putsch were almost immediately arrested, but this putsch got front page news across the world. There was also a 24-day trial, which was really widely publicised, and Hitler was kind of given this stage to continue his public speaking and to have a wider audience, because many people were watching this trial with a great interest, and they were reading what Hitler was saying, and this nationalist vibe that Hitler was giving off was really resonating with a lot of people, not just in Germany, but across the world. He was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 5 years. And while he was in jail, which when we say he was in jail, we don't quite mean like a normal jail where you've got concrete walls and a barred door, and that's it. His prison stay was very, very luxurious. He got a nice room. He basically got an apartment. He had a sink. He had a toilet. He got to talk with. He was imprisoned with the people that he did the putsch with. So he was with someone all the time. He was given writing materials. Basically, he was just put under house arrest essentially. And while he was in jail, he wrote Mein Kampf. And well, when I say he wrote it, he spoke it, and Rudolf Hess and who else? Emil Maurice wrote it down. And after 9 months, and after this book was released, Hitler was released from prison. Mein Kampf in Germany became the second most sold book between 1923 and 1933, only beaten by the Bible. So, as you can see, even though the actual putsch itself was completely a failure, what actually happened was Hitler turned it into a win, and eventually, in the next 10 years, Hitler managed to get his wish and take control of Germany himself. So, that's the information for the 3 uprisings. That's what you need to know. Oh, that's not moving forwards. There we go. So, on the VLE, there is information from the white book and information from the red book that has been scanned in for you. This is what we'd like you to do. Using the informations, answer the questions on the worksheet that you've got. So, let me just go to the VLE so I can make it clear. Here's the worksheet that you've got. So, that's what you can be filling in. Here we go. Lots of questions. And the information is on these PDFs here, so you can download those, you can look at it, and you can answer the questions. So we go back to the slideshow, and then I would like you to fill in these temperature gauges to say that the Treaty of Versailles heavily influenced this event at the top, or it did not influence this event at all at the bottom. Hopefully, I've kind of given you an idea of where these events come from and why they happened, and you should be able to answer that relatively easily. And then there's a challenge question at the bottom, if you get a chance to do that. What do these political events tell us about the stability of Germany by 1923? You should be able to answer that based on what I've said and what's in those book questions pages. There is also an interpretation question on page 28. Highlight the content and the provenance of the source. Okay, what does it say? Who wrote it and why did they write it? Compare them. Why are they different? And which one convinces you the most? You can just answer those questions with 1 or 2 words. I don't want you to answer it like an exam question because you've already should have done that and sent it to me at some point. So that's just for you to keep practicing that skill, because you'll need to be able to do that skill for your exam. And finally, you can draw a diagram to show how the new Weimar Constitution worked, because we're going to be talking about the Weimar Republic in much more detail in the lessons coming up, because at the moment we are only on doing 1919 to 1923, and the Weimar Republic lasted all the way up until 1933. So we're going to be spending a lot of time on that. So if you know what the Constitution was and how it worked, then that will help you with future lessons. And that's it. So I hope that makes sense, Year 10. I hope you know what to do for your lessons, and if you've got any problems, then please let me know as soon as possible so I can sort them out for you. Thank you again for watching this video, and thank you for taking the stuff in, and hopefully we shall get some more of my exam questions back so I can mark some more people's and know that everyone is getting on absolutely fine. Once again, stay safe and keep inside and keep working, Year 10, because, you know, work is good for you.